Good evening, everyone. Welcome on a cold and rainy, which is to say a Dublin Monday night, and in a time when there's a well-known virus going around. We're delighted that so many of you have come here this evening, and I can assure you you're going to be delighted that you have come here this evening. Our speaker tonight, Elizabeth Lev, who is a friend and a person that I'm always inspired to hear speak, is an American-born art historian. Now, she wrote this sentence, and it's a different sentence today, but I'm still going to read it because it's true, with the good fortune to live and work in Rome. Life in the eternal city allows her the perfect environment to pursue her many passions. On an average day, one can find her working on her latest article or book, preparing for speaking engagements, and especially her extraordinary gift of touring visitors through the treasures of Rome. She did a PhD in art history at the University of Chicago, moved to northern Italy to do graduate work at the University of Bologna, and researched her thesis on the Church of San Giovanni in Petronio in Rome. She has lived in Rome since when now, Liz? 1997? 1997. Okay. Shortly after her decision to live in Rome, she began giving tours for cultural associations. She has passed the licensing exam for guides, which is demanding. That same year, she began teaching art history in Duquesne University's Italian campus, where she continues to be a faculty member, along with teaching for John Cabot University in Rome. She has also joined the teaching university at the Pontifical University of the Angelicum, as well as Christendom College. When not teaching, she writes books. She's written 3 books. She writes articles. She writes talks, which we're about to be benefiting from tonight. And in addition to all that, she's a sommelier. So there's nothing that Liz can't do or know. That's all the formal stuff. I was walking to church this morning and thought, how would I want to introduce Liz Lev? And it's a pretty basic thought that I had, which is, when you're with children and like you're tossing your nephew in the air and they love it and they say again, because children delight, and when they delight in something they want to repeat it. And any time I have heard Liz Lev speak about anything, anywhere, as soon as she's done, I want to say, childlike, again. Liz Lev.
Well, thank you for such a lovely introduction, and thank you for coming out and being in the same room with me, a Roman. I am 2 minutes away from becoming Typhoid Liz, but for this evening, I'm going to enjoy myself with you and bring you, since apparently the Sistine Chapel will be closed until April 3rd, maybe even longer. It's my opportunity to bring you this incredibly beautiful space and tell you a little bit about what makes it so extraordinary. And it's a space that, of course, everybody's heard of, Sistine Chapel, but it becomes kind of reductive to that, there's that guy of the fingers touching, et cetera, et cetera. But really the Sistine Chapel, its extraordinary magic is that it brings together 30,000 visitors a day. I mean, up until 2 weeks ago, it brings 30,000 visitors a day in high season, and they all stand together in kind of a common, they have a common experience. And so that's what I want to explore with you this evening. And so this behind the veil stuff, there are many different ways we can think about it, but I think the very first veil we have to start with is the extraordinary gift of the restoration. We have the privilege of understanding the Sistine Chapel, experiencing the Sistine Chapel in our day and age in a way that even Michelangelo didn't, because you have all of the paintings, all of the work in the Sistine Chapel restored, and this all took place. It was a gift of St. John Paul II. So just kind of giving you a sense of what the chapel originally looked like. Oh, I seem to be having a bit of an argument with the, here we go, and it's on, it's off, and it's on. Technology, not my friend. Okay, and no, all right, we can't move it. All right, here we go. This is, it usually, if it touches me, technology tends to fall apart. I thought this was uniquely to me, but our favorite motto in the Vatican is actually the Vatican, yesterday's technology, tomorrow. So So before we get started with the pictures, I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview of what I want to talk about, and that is how the Sistine Chapel was restored from 1981 to 1989. The beginning of the restoration was an enormous project. John Paul II was elected in 1978 in a darkened chapel completely covered with a patina, literally a veil of dirt that obscured the image for all these years. And one of the very first things he wanted to work on was to allow that chapel to speak with its full voice again. He really wanted that chapel cleaned. And you think in a day and age where restoration, we talk about restoration, we love restoration, in a day and age where restoration is the norm, we're thinking, yeah, what's the problem? The problem was $11 million in 1978 to clean some painting was not something people thought about. So the incredible campaign to clean the Sistine Chapel started out with having to sell copyrights to the Nippon Television Company in order to get the first funding. And once the new colors were revealed, then everybody wanted in. And so 30 years ago, the Society of the Patrons of the Vatican Museums was formed in order to be able to in order to be able to continue the work of the restoration. So that in 1994, John Paul II was able to give a homily in the newly cleaned chapel, meaning that the ceiling was clean, the Last Judgment was clean, and even the side panels had been cleaned to perfection. And in that speech, he spoke about the priceless heritage, which was the Sistine Chapel, for all humanity. So at the end of the day, what I'm going to be talking to you about is how a work of art that was made 500 years ago, and if I may use the woke language by a bunch of white guys for a bunch of white guys, all in this European little room, how did that space end up speaking to people from all over the world in the kind of level and the kind of numbers that we find today? How are we doing on this clicker thing? Because I actually have one in my bag. After many, many years of traveling everywhere, I bring my own clicker, so if you need one, I got it. There we go. All right. We have... And for our first miracle, okay, so this is just an image of showing you what it looked like. This is a really, really cool image. Look at the background of the Mass taking place. That's what the Last Judgment looked like. Followed by, this is John Paul II speaking at the restoration of April 8th of 1994, followed by this. And this is where my own personal story intersects, because when this was being done, I don't want you to look at the dates too closely because that would just get embarrassing, but when this was being done, I was studying art history and I was specifically getting a degree in Renaissance art. And as I was studying these dark images, I was like, oh, I don't want to do this, is so boring. I'm going to go to Dutch art, that's more fun. Except you have to learn Dutch, so that was kind of a non-starter. But my professor came in, it wasn't this image, but my professor came in, and he was literally shaking, he was so excited. And he took out the color transparency machine. I know all the young people have no idea what I'm talking about, but a few you know of what I speak, right? So he takes out this color transparency machine, he puts in this image of an image that looks in the cleaned one, and he says, we have to rethink Michelangelo. And in many ways, the rest of my life has simply been that, rethinking Michelangelo. So I have a particular debt to St. John Paul II and the cleaning of that chapel, because it really did set the course of the rest of my life. So let's get a little bit of the spade work of the Sistine Chapel out of the way. The Sistine Chapel was painted in 3 different segments. Segment number 1 are the side walls, done between 1480 and 1482. They are painted by what a friend of mine calls the dream team of Florentine art, including names like Botticelli, Perugino, Luca Signorelli, but not Michelangelo. They are the state-of-the-art of painting of the generation when Michelangelo was 5 years old. The next phase will be that's done by Sixtus IV, and the rood screen, it dates to the exact same period. Rood screens, which I believe you know, they are separators between lay people and clergy. They were present in churches until the Counter-Reformation, and so it's very important when you understand the Sistine Chapel to realize that up until the 16th century, that gate in the middle of the chapel separated lay people from clergy, and that indeed clergy is the overwhelming majority and lay people are an afterthought. It speaks volumes of the kind of audience you're dealing with. After that, you have the vault of the Sistine Chapel done by Michelangelo with the scenes of Genesis. He was between the ages of 33 and 37 when he painted the ceiling, and then 25 years later, and we'll see a lot happens in that 25 years, Michelangelo paints the Last Judgment, and that is something done between 1534 and 1541. He is in his late 50s, early 60s when he completes the chapel. So these are the three different segments we're going to be looking at in the course of this talk, watching a very 75 years that progress, but the things that happen in those 75 years and how they are reflected in the art is amazing. So we start with the origins of this chapel. It was built by Pope Sixtus IV. That is where the name comes from, Sixtus Sistine. He had it built by a military architect, as far as we know, Baccio Pontelli, and that is why the exterior of the building is not very exciting. Among the top three things I am accustomed to hearing when people walk into the Sistine Chapel, one of them is, "Oh, I thought it would be bigger." Okay, I guess the painting's not enough. I hate to break it to you, but we put all the architecture chips into St. Peter's. If you're not impressed with St. Peter's Basilica, we have a problem. But otherwise, it's just a chapel. And so it's a relatively large chapel. It was meant to hold about 350 to 500 men. But nonetheless, it was well defended. Those are battlements for soldiers to be stationed. But it is a building that is meant to contain. That is why it is such an ideal place for the papal election, right? You can shut the building off, leave the cardinals in a space where they can be well defended, but once you've shut them off from the world, how do you open them up to the Holy Spirit? How do you awaken this? How do you evoke this incredible event of the Holy Spirit there present as they're making this impactful decision? And in the church, we have three privileged ways of doing this, right? We have music, we have the liturgy, and we have art. And yeah, I know art's the least important, but and in the Sistine Chapel on an average day, you're not going to have the liturgy and you're not going to have the music, but we still have the art. And we hear one of these beautiful voices of the chapel. So this is what it looked like when it was completed in 1482. You had the side panels, which showed on one side stories of Jesus, and on the other side the stories of Moses. They parallel each other. The lower level has a false painted drapery. I don't know how many times I have heard people talk about its similarity in its proportions to the temple in Jerusalem, which is, whoops, wait, what just happened here? Okay, this is going to be one of those days, I can tell. So it has a similarity to the temple in Jerusalem, which people talk about in the proportions, which, okay. I don't really see how that works in a building. The proportions may be similar, but I find it very hard to believe that was the model. Another very popular model to evoke is the Great Chapel in Avignon. Maybe. I've got another one for you, which is a little bit more homegrown, and that would be the Upper Basilica of Assisi. I am fairly certain that Sixtus IV, who was the head of the Franciscan order, who lived most of his life at the Basilica in Assisi, I'm pretty sure that this is what he was thinking of. And you can see in the side walls of Assisi, you have what? You have a series of painted stories telling the life of St. Francis, and underneath it is false painted drapery, and the ceiling is painted of blue sky with stars. So this space, which the Franciscans imagined as a space of preaching, is what Sixtus IV was trying to create, is what I proposed to you. Sixtus IV was trying to create when he built his chapel. And here are some of the images of the Dream Team, and they're along these side walls. So we have one very, very famous painting, The Calling of the First Two Apostles by Domenico Ghirlandaio, who, because he got Sistine Chapel on his CV, a few years later in his workshop had a knock on his door. And who was standing there but Ludovico Buonarroti with his 13-year-old son Michelangelo? And the question was, are you one of those guys who painted in the Sistine Chapel? Oh, yeah, I did. Great. Could you teach my kid to paint? So he became Michelangelo's painting teacher. Granted, Michelangelo slept through fresco class, only stuck around for 3 years, but, he is the man who taught him how to grind pigments and mix colors. colors. The other really fascinating pairing, and this is a really cool thing that happened, they brought in together a team of different painters. And directly across from each other, on the Moses side and on the Jesus side, they brought in Botticelli and Perugino. These are the two most famous painters in 1480. It's like when you get Robert De Niro and Al Pacino in a movie together, and it goes, oh my gosh. Right, so you get these two together, and they're painting two very different stories. One is the delivery of the keys, and the other one is the punishment of Korah. But remember what the function of that space is. One of its jobs is the election of the Pope. And so in the image of the delivery of the keys, Matthew 16, verse 18, as Jesus gives those keys to Peter, look at how peaceful it is. The apostles are all sitting around quietly. Oh, this is great. I'm so happy for you, Peter. In the background, you have triumphal arches. You have an 8-sided building, a symbol of renewal. Look how wonderful it is when everyone agrees and gets along. The parallel story, of course, is when Moses tried to hand off his authority to his brother Aaron, and the Korah family said, well, why Aaron? Why not us? Don't you think we'd have a cook-off and let God decide? And so in the midst of this big, I'm going to make one sacrifice, Aaron's going to make another sacrifice, God got irritated, opened the earth, and sucked the Korah family into it. And so when Botticelli paints this painting, look what he puts in, another triumphal arch. He and Perugino are talking to each other. Except the triumphal arch of Botticelli is falling apart, and there's chaos and there's confusion. What a terrific message to the cardinals as they cross that rood screen. It's the last thing you see before you cross the rood screen, to go in and place that fateful vote. Remember, the results of this decision, if you accept it, we have order, we have peace, we have renewal. If you don't, we have chaos. So the next one is the chapel is completed, and along comes the next person to work on the chapel, whose name is Julius II della Rovere. As it just so happens, he was the nephew of Pope Sixtus IV. Now, he was painted here as he's standing in front of Sixtus IV at the foundation of Vatican Library, and he's actually in the Sistine Chapel, painted by none other than Botticelli. You probably know him best from this painting, the aged Julius II, painted by Raphael 2 years before he died in 1512. And he brought Michelangelo in to work on the next phase of the chapel. The idea was he wanted Michelangelo to paint a new design on the chapel ceiling, which had been painted as a blue sky with stars, which is the most typical way of painting chapel ceilings in the world. Michelangelo actually thought about doing it. This is an actual drawing done by Michelangelo, who was thinking about doing this kind of design. And do you see how he was going to do the 12 apostles? The arrow points to one of the apostle figures. And then all around he was going to do a kind of geometric design, which would have looked something like this. This is from the Borgia apartments downstairs. The Sistine Chapel almost looked like that. You know what that would mean? I wouldn't be here tonight. So the Michelangelo, who was a little concerned about building the Michelangelo brand, came up with another idea. And he said, if I do those 12 apostles on the ceiling, it's going to look like every ceiling anybody's ever made. And of course, we can't have that. So if you've got Jesus and Moses in here, well, why don't I do Genesis? Why don't I do Genesis? For you and me today, no brainer. Oh, of course, Genesis, go for it. The Pope rolls his eyes into the back of his head and goes, oh, Lord, artists, and tries to explain to Michelangelo why this is not possible. Now, I'm going to explain it to you in a 40-second lesson in history of perspective. And so, the reason why is that originally painting when painting is making a three-dimensional image on a two-dimensional surface. One of the first steps forward is in the 13th century, 14th century, when Giotto begins optical perspective. So you can see the figures kind of stand at an angle and they try to make three dimensions. This is followed by the development of one-point linear perspective, where with Fra Angelico we see a foreground, a middle ground, and all the lines converging at a single point, creating foreground, middle ground, background, background and relative distances. Along comes Leonardo da Vinci and says, ooh, let me create a beautifully organized space with a group of apostles. We can make a very contained space, fill it up with figures, and then along comes Raphael and says, oh, I can put 60 figures in. This is the state of art of painting. So in 1500, when people think of painting, they think in terms of making an artificial three-dimensional space and filling it up. And so when Michelangelo starts talking about painting stories on the ceiling, the Pope is thinking about, a whole bunch of packed paintings on a ceiling more or less this height, and he thinks it's going to end up looking like a Jackson Pollock painting. And so he says something along the lines of, yeah, Mike, I'm afraid it can't be done. And then Michelangelo proved it could be done. And that not only that, he was the only man in the world who could do it. Why? Because he's not a painter. Michelangelo was a sculptor. He had left Ghirlandaio's studio. He had been the sculptor of the Pietà. Then he's the man who made the David. And what does a sculptor do? A sculptor takes a piece of stone, and with a hammer and chisel, he takes away. Sculptors think reductively. Painters think additively. It's that mentality of Michelangelo that makes him the perfect person. As a matter of fact, he had been called to Rome to design a tomb. He was thinking sculpture, architecture, every single minute, and that is the secret of the Sistine Chapel. He succeeds in making this sculptural architectural thing. And so he gets permission. He puts a list of his contract, looked like, one of these American sitcom stars. Like, I want green M&Ms in my dressing room. He had to design his own scaffolding. I'm firing all the talented people because they're going to steal my ideas. He just, one thing after another, he ended up painting 80% of the painting himself while standing. So I'm sorry to debunk this story, but no, he was not lying on his back. This sketch here, the stick figure, is Michelangelo himself, drawn by himself, and it's next to the poem he wrote, which you see to the right, in which he complains about painting the Sistine Chapel, which he did with alarming regularity. And so, what did we get out of all this? Again, look at the paint, look at the work without the actual panel figures, look at the framework. This is the work of a sculptor-architect. Everything you look at is paint. Everything you're seeing is paint. The marble is paint. And then he made a series of little skylights that would make it possible for the story to unfold. And look at how this works. It's a brilliant, the impact is from that moment on, everybody else has to paint ceilings. So, we start on the far side, we start on the far end closest to the altar. It begins in the altar with the separation of light and dark. God created light, separated from darkness. That's the end of the first day. So Michelangelo's painting is a stripe of white, a stripe of pink, a stripe of gray. It is evident someone forgot his Crayola box that day. But what is really interesting about the work is against that simplicity of three colors, look at the power he gets in that torso. And that, it comes from his unique and special engagement with ancient art. At the same time Michelangelo was planning for the Sistine Chapel, the rediscovery of an ancient sculpture mentioned by Pliny, the most famous sculpture in the ancient world, the Laocoon, had been made before Michelangelo's eyes on January 14th of 1506. He was there when the work was uncovered. He identified the work. It was purchased by the Pope. It was placed in the Vatican. And Michelangelo found himself in front of his true forebear, the last great, brilliant ancient sculptor. Like he, too, was a great sculptor. And what did he do with this figure? He looked at this figure, which is the story of Laocoon from the Trojan War, who was the pagan priest who dies trying to warn the Trojans about that big old Greek horse. He looks at an image which is fundamentally a pagan priest dying. And what does he do? He takes the energy in that torso, he confers it on the image of God bringing existence into existence. You want to know what's special about Michelangelo? He was probably the only man who could look at a work of ancient art and never be subjugated by it. He never thought, oh my gosh, I better do an image of somebody being tortured to death because that'll kind of keep with the spirit. Nope. He took ancient art and he used it completely on his own terms. He could take a pagan image of death and he could turn it into a Judeo-Christian image of life. That's who Michelangelo was. And so he moves on to the second one with the creation of the sun and the moon and the vegetable life. And yes, I know this is again in the second most frequent observations in the Sistine Chapel is God's enormous rear end. Which, contrary to what 70% of English-speaking tours like to suggest, that it perhaps might be God mooning the Pope. I hate to break it to you, but that does not translate into Italian. It is actually much more interesting. It is an allusion to the invisibility of God the Father. It is a reminder that no one saw God in the Old Testament. The person who came the closest was Moses, who was only allowed to see God's back parts. So as God is creating, rushing around doing this, he's flying here, he's flying there, for the room full of theologians who were the people who were standing underneath that painting. It addresses the most shocking thing about the Sistine Chapel. The most shocking thing about the Sistine Chapel is not the nude figure. It's God the Father in the body running around. There are like 4 images of extreme sports God flying around the Sistine Chapel ceiling. It is unthinkable. Jesus, yes, but what are we doing here? And it's a reminder that that visibility, that incarnation, that is the subtext of the entire Sistine Chapel. No visible God, no incarnation, no Sistine Chapel. There is no other religion that could have ever come up with this except for Christianity, which has that unique and extraordinary idea that God became visible and knowable, and Michelangelo took it to a whole new level. And so this little image, if the only thing you will see is after you hide in the crevice of my rocks or my back parts, is like the preview of the movie you always wanted to see. That rear end of God is like the trailer coming up, the Black Widow movie coming May 2020. We all can't wait, right? It's like that sense of a trailer. Then, literally a trailer. Anyway, the separation of earth and sky, this is one art historians argue about. I'm going to spare you our argument. I will simply point out to you that "and God saw that it was good" is actually repeated 7 times in Genesis. And so the idea of God flying like this really seems much more convincing as the image than any of these separation of earth and sky or land and water or celestial and terrestrial firmament. And that brings us to the most famous scene of all. So the way the ceiling works is you have these 3 images of God flying around, then he pauses, and then the drama begins. All of a sudden, you have the first figure you can see clearly. If you're standing at the back of the chapel in the lay people section where you're supposed to be standing, Adam stands out. He's a light figure against a dark background. He's meant to be noticed. He's meant to be noticed at a distance. And the only thing that's interesting, the only thing that's striking is we go to all this trouble to gaze upon first man. And what's our first impression here? He's looking a little lazy, right? There's a little something about Adam here that looks like he's trying to hit the snooze button on the alarm clock. I mean, I dare say this is anything but up and Adam. Anyway, making sure you're awake. And then when you see that, so Michelangelo, the thing about his art, you must always look at his figures twice. This is a rule with Michelangelo. It's never meant to be understood the first time round. You look at him once, heavy leg, heavy arm. Look at him again. Look at that bent knee. Look at the separation between the ear and the shoulder. That's not a weak, lazy figure. Those are the muscle groups of a runner at a starting block. And so what God is doing in that beautiful tension of the fingers a millimeter apart, he's about to awaken that potential in Adam. We are left at the edge of our seats waiting for that contact to happen. When the arm will lift, the leg will lift, and Adam will take his place as God's greatest creation. And he does not stop there. The other half of the painting, which is almost always neglected, leads us into the image of Eve. God's other arm is curled around this female figure, and look at her, the way her arm curls around him. She's no afterthought. She's no, oh, all right. She's part of a divine plan from the very beginning. In this painting, Adam and Eve are never apart. They are always together. If there's an image of Adam, there's an image of Eve. God is creating Adam. Eve is on the back of his mind, as it were. God's hand plays on the shoulder of the child. You'll notice that he has a second knuckle, just so you don't miss the image. Just think, don't miss this. Look, there's another figure there. And that figure, we believe, is the image of Jesus. The previewing of, as God is creating man, he's already aware of the imminent fall, and he's aware of his own plan to erupt into human history to save humanity as Jesus Christ. That preview of the incarnation that you saw in the separation of land or the creation of sun, moon, and vegetable life is fulfilled in the image of the creation of man. Also, just as a note, really cool article written in 1990 by Richard Meshberger, in which he, to kind of continue this idea of this being on God's mind, wrote a really lovely article in which his very technical comparison to the outline of God's cape to the human brain, and reminding us that Michelangelo actually did a great many dissections during his time in Florence, really lends credence to this idea of a logos. God is this logos, and sharing that, giving a tiny spark of it to man, is what elevates him above all creation. And also, by the way, I do like to point out at this point, now that we've already handled the question of Eve, the creation of woman is actually the dead center of the ceiling. I know y'all think it's the creation of man, but it's not. The dead center of the ceiling is actually the creation of woman. I have been known to suggest that's because Adam was only practice and God got it right later. But the actual reason for it is the chapel is dedicated to the Blessed Virgin, and it's beautiful and really quite wonderful to be here in this chapel of St. John Henry Newman, because this is really, he articulated it quite beautifully, but this is really Mary as the new Eve. We are dealing with the theology of the Immaculate Conception, not laid out clearly as it was in the 19th century with the dogma behind it, but this feeling its way towards the implication and the meaning and the justification of the Immaculate Conception. This is a good moment for me to tell you that the person who put the Immaculate Conception on the universal calendar was none other than Sixtus IV. And so this is, it all kind of converges together. Anyway, now we're Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, in which there's a Garden of Eden. Had they not eaten the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, it is highly likely that Adam and Eve would have starved to death. There seems to be nothing in Michelangelo's garden, but by now you should be used to this. It is evident that Michelangelo was not a noun guy. He's really a verb guy. It's not about what is there. He's much more interested in the before and after pictures, because this is essentially a before and after picture. Inside Eden, we see Adam and Eve represented by the greatest sculptor in the world. We see them represented as immortal. Immortality comes across as these luminous bodies. They're buoyant, they're beautiful. These people are never going to age. They're never going to suffer. They're never going to die. They're never going to catch coronavirus. And then the people on the other side, their bodies are very different. They're still Adam and Eve, but look how the bodies change. Look at that eye of the sculptor. The erect posture you see in the first image hunches over. The luminosity of the bodies on the left-hand side drains. And you can see physically gravity dogging at their every step. Michelangelo shows the moment the body became a burden to man. It's an incredible way of representing this. And that painting, just to be a little bit more obnoxious, he placed in a very specific place. Look where it stands. Right above the choir screen or the rood screen. So where you and I could go no further in the church is where you and I get kicked out of earthly paradise, and that's simply intended to rub it in. Now, the last three scenes, here, by the way, from this moment, it's an interesting little side note, since we're finishing the images of Adam and Eve together, that complementarity of men and women continues throughout the rest of the painting. So everywhere there's a major male figure, there's a major female figure. So in the corners of the ceiling, you have the stories of David and Moses, but in the other two corners, you're going to have Judith and Holofernes and Esther and the story of Haman, and the punishment of Haman. So you have two heroes and two heroines. Esther and Judith, by the way, two heroines always associated with the Immaculate Conception. Then you have the ancestors, who are my favorites. I love these images for a number of reasons. They're painted very quickly. Michelangelo produced these paintings over the course of 1, 2, 3 giornate. The technique he used, fresco, is a slaked lime plaster applied to the wall. You have to apply your pigment while the plaster is still wet, and you have about 6 hours drying time. The images I've been showing you, they could take 2 or 3 weeks to paint because you only do a little section, you're very meticulous, you're very careful, you underline the drawings, you don't want to make mistakes because if the plaster dries you have to take a chisel. These are painted in 1, 2, or 3 days, 3 days max. And that, just to give you an idea of what that is, that's the equivalent of a digital image. It's like a cell phone camera image. There's no underdrawing. He's looking and then he's painting. He's looking and then he's painting. It's coming spontaneous. And what's so beautiful about it is that this is the ancestry of Jesus. This is the Gospel of Matthew, the beginning of Matthew. Abraham begat Isaac, begat Jacob, and so on and so forth, the so-called begats. In the begats, I believe there are, 7 women mentioned for, the 42 men. In Michelangelo's ceiling, every male figure is complemented by a female figure. So the mothers in the genealogy, they may not get names, but Michelangelo gave each one of them a face and a personality. So you have this mom, this really great multitasking mom, like she's rocking a cradle with her foot, and then she's holding the baby, and he's sleeping. And then you have this one, she's arranging dinner and kind of chatting with her baby over here. This one, this little overworked mother, she's got 3 kids that are like all over her. But what beautiful spontaneity. And what exceptional images of motherhood he gives us. It opens up a little window to thinking a little bit differently about Michelangelo than the way art history has handed him down over the course of the generations. Then we get to, after that, the stories of Noah. We have Noah's flood, which is an image of universal salvation. There are no animals on Noah's ark. Nobody cares about the animals. The animals show up later. That guy is sitting on an animal. They get sacrificed. And then we get to the end of Noah's story, where Noah becomes a farmer, grows grapes, invents wine, drinks the wine, gets drunk, and passes out naked in his barn. So I have now told you the story of the world's most famous ceiling cycle or painting cycle in the world. And if you have been following, you realize it starts with God creating light and it ends up with some guy blind drunk in a barn, which seems a little bit like a downward spiral or my student semester abroad. And the fact of the matter is it's a really funny way to end, but it's not only that. Notice what he contrasts these two figures. That atom, which is all luminous potential, and then the position of Noah, which is the same position, but everything has become heavy, limp, weak. That all that potential seems dissipated in the drunkenness of Noah. What is more, it is also the darkest scene of the entire Sistine Chapel ceiling. So here on the far right-hand side is where Noah, as you can see on the far left, is where the story starts, the separation of light and dark, blah, blah, blah. And then it gets progressively darker and chaotic till you get to the drunkenness of Noah. At that point, with the drunkenness of Noah, right behind you is the exit entrance door, the real entrance door to the Sistine Chapel. So basically, you take one more step backwards, and you are literally out of the picture. You are as far away from the altar as you can possibly be, and there you are looking under this pathetic figure of Noah who started out by saving humanity and then turned out not to be much of a savior, and you're asking yourself, wait a minute, how do I get out of here? And this is the moment that Michelangelo finally found his Crayola box. He started with a figure immediately next to that drunken Noah are the first bright colors of the whole ceiling. What it meant to clean that ceiling, all of a sudden we went, that's how he does it. That's how he changes the story. We get caught, our eye gets caught by the emerald green and the topaz yellow of the prophet Zechariah, saying, what? Return to me, says the Lord Almighty, and I will return to you. And that's what you're going to do next. You're going to follow these men and women you see along the side, these bright, bright, bright colored figures. They're going to draw your eye towards the altar. So then you'll see a Sibyl, the Delphic Sibyl in this particular case. She draws your eye a little closer, bright colors, body turning inwards. From the Delphic Sibyl, we move on to Isaiah, again moving inwards. The figures get bigger and bigger. They get brighter and brighter. You'll notice they're always illuminated on one side. The side they're illuminated on is always the side that's closest to the altar. Look at the bright yellow on Daniel's robe until you get to the very end, right by the altar. And the beautiful Libyan Sibyl closes the book of prophecies in her flame-colored dress. Look how the colors have changed from the Delphic Sibyl to the Libyan Sibyl. She's the color of fire. And that brings you to the final figure. The figure Michelangelo waited 3.5 years to paint. He started with Noah. He was working towards the altar. This is the last thing he painted on the ceiling. It's the largest figure of anything on the ceiling. The figure tilts towards you, and yet Jonah appears to tilt backwards. 5 people in the world could do that kind of foreshortening. And if you look at his feet, they are the only feet of any figure of the entire Sistine Chapel. They dangle in midair. You can actually see the shadow underneath it. He looks like he's going to fall off the altar. And where would he land? He would fall off the ceiling to land on the altar below. And just a little bit of a note of what every single person would have understood in 1512. We don't think about it anymore, but in 1512, the presence of the figure Jonah in a chapel above an altar would have made perfect sense, because Jonah is the quintessential prophet of the resurrection. He is the image of Jesus' death and resurrection, which of course we represent on the altar. So basically, for someone to walk in 1512 and not know what the image of Jonah meant, even though Jonah's sitting next to a sea bass, because Michelangelo didn't get out much, to walk into the chapel and not know what the image of Jonah was, the reaction to that would be similar to your reaction if someone walked up and saw the image of the apple with the bite taken out of it and said, "Oh, what's that?" You'd be like, what planet do you live on? So it's such a common image. Anyway, so Michelangelo with Jonah brings us through the beginning of creation, all the way through Noah, all the way through the prophets, and Jonah takes us from the Old Testament into real time, leading into where we are today, redeemed and waiting for the Last Judgment. So, Michelangelo completes the Sistine Chapel ceiling, moves back to Florence, decides I've basically slammed the door and said, I'm never going back to that town again. But as we all know, never say never. And Michelangelo, 25 years later, was called back. 25 years later, was called back to the Sistine Chapel. In the 25 years between his finishing the ceiling and he beginning the Last Judgment, the world had changed. I think many of us can say the world today, those of us who've been around for 25 years or so, we can say the world we've lived through times that are pretty much as drastically different. We can sympathize with the Michelangelo. What did he experience during the course of those 25 years? He saw the rise of Martin Luther. He saw the invention, not the invention, but the printing press coming online. The printing press already existed, but it was kind of like the cell phones in the 1980s. I'm sure there are a few of you who know of what I speak, like these gigantic cell phones that you carried like a person, carried. The printing presses were cumbersome. They weren't quite as active. By 1550, they were producing 150 million pieces of paper through Europe a year. There was the sack of Rome, and then finally, the year that Michelangelo was approached to paint, the year that Michelangelo came to paint the Sistine Chapel's Last Judgment, is the same year that Henry VIII wrote a letter to the Pope, to Pope Clement VII, which went something along the lines of, "Hi, starting my own church, love Henry," signed by all the cardinals and bishops of England except for John Fisher, who got his head cut off. And so you have the Pope looking at, this letter and thinking in the Sistine Chapel with the other cardinals there, basically wondering, how many of you are thinking about doing the same thing? So, if you need the big guns to make a very important message, who do you call? You call Michelangelo. And so Michelangelo made his way to Rome reluctantly. He put it off a lot. And he produced the ultimate image of accountability, because that's the purpose of this painting. And the great mistakes that are made with this painting is when they think it was made for everyday people, like you and I were supposed to go in and see the Last Judgment. Look where it is. It's the altar wall. It's where only this very elite group of clergy could stand on the inside of the rood screen. It is under that wall that the cardinals elect the Pope and put the vote in the urn. And so it was that painting that was meant to be the great call to order. The Pope worked closely with Michelangelo so that he could produce the Last Judgment. Now, the Last Judgment, on top of everything else, has a very interesting shape. It's actually formed to look a bit like the Ten Commandments. Most people have noticed this. And so you have, it's tilted slightly towards you, so you have this impression of the Ten Commandments are about to fall on you. It's a sort of a very large painting made up of only human figures. Typical Last Judgments would have registers. If they were meant for regular people to look at, they're divided up with a lot of lettering, so you can find out what's going on. You understand what's happening. Michelangelo's is pure disruption. In a room full of everything everything's got architectural frameworks, his Last Judgment is just this lapis blue wall and this tumble of bodies, and you're disoriented when you look at it, and you are supposed to be. What is more, you will look in the lower corner of the very bottom of the painting. Now in this one you see the crucifix, and that is the thing closest to your own eye level, so you'll notice that first. Behind that crucifix is a cave of demons in which the demon on the far left is looking right at you. You walk into the Sistine Chapel, the first thing you see on that altar is a demon who's like, coming for you. And so you're thinking, uh-oh, until you realize what's in front of that demon, the crucifix. And there is Jesus, arms spread, keeping that demon at bay. Michelangelo knows there's going to be that crucifix on the altar. He plans the painting around that liturgical object, and then right above it, he adds these angels blowing their horns, calling the dead back to life, this incredible spiral that makes like a halo for the crucifix. The angels holding open books. They're showing you, look what Jesus did for you. And they ask that rather awkward question, hey, what'd you do for Jesus? It's going to be a bad day. Your giveaway is that the little book contains the good deeds, and the very large multi-volume tome contains the bad deeds. Then you have the bodies breaking away from it. Beautiful. The bodies breaking away from the ground. This image of the bodily resurrection, these big, huge bodies. One of them is actually waiting to get his skin back over there in the corner. Ministry on the far left-hand side. The battle between angels and demons. This incredibly active, physical pulling away from the dirt that binds you. Then you move up to this next section, which is a little mysterious. This confuses a lot of people. Because some people suggest that it's purgatory, no purgatory in the day of the Last Judgment. What you have is an interesting group of people of which none of which can be identified. And that's what the painting, I think it's very interesting because that's what reveals this painting is a Catholic painting. You have a whole bunch of people who are helping each other up to heaven. These people are clearly helping each other up. Now, one of them has a single identifying symbol, except for maybe, just maybe, the guy on the right-hand side holding the rosary beads could be St. Dominic, but hard to tell because he's got no clothes on. And so the idea is that you're looking at people who are helping other people into heaven. This practice that we have in the church of praying for the dead, and the dead pray for us, and we help each other. Michelangelo creates an entire register of people helping each other, and he doesn't stop there. Michelangelo is a child of the age of discovery. He was 17 years old when Christopher Columbus found the New World. When he painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling, it was the same year, that Julius II was setting up the first diocese in the New World in Haiti. There was a whole new world that had to be evangelized. When he came along to paint this, Magellan had already found his way into the Pacific Ocean. The church's mission had just gone global. So Michelangelo added a kind of interesting little detail in what you see here on the right-hand side, these two people being pulled up by rosaries. One is an African man, one is a Caucasian man. You are 400 years before the American Civil Rights Movement, and yet Michelangelo has given you an image of universal salvation. So this idea of salvation meant for everyone, it's very front and center in the painting. So then he works his way up to the next section, the people helping other people getting into heaven, and of course after that we reach the saints. And that's where the trouble begins. The typical way of showing saints is what I'm showing you here. I'm not going to give you 35 images to make my art historical point, but if you like, you can find them. The typical way of showing saints in heaven is that there is actually a little saint uniform. You get a long pastel dress, you get a big gold halo. Luca Signorelli, Fra Angelico, both gave you paradise with these beautiful saints in their fabulous outfits. Michelangelo went in a slightly different direction. So if Giotto's saints, again, pastel dresses, big gold halos, marching towards the heavens, the little bodies coming out of the ground are naked, the people who are going to heaven get some clothes. Not Michelangelo, who apparently was taking the attitude, if you've got it, flaunt it. And so you have these incredibly beautiful bodies that are meant to represent these glorious bodies they are given in heaven. There's no shame to these bodies. There's no defect to these bodies. They're perfect. These people who have exercised heroic virtue have these beautiful bodies. So let's take one example, I think a really obvious one, John the Baptist, who we know, oddly enough, his diet. We don't get everyone's diet. We get Daniel's, apparently, and John the Baptist. John the Baptist lived on locusts and wild honey, which, as far as I know, is not a bulk-up diet. And so on the left-hand side, the typical John the Baptist is kind of the skinny, emaciated guy. He, amazingly enough, turned into Mr. Universe in the hand of, apparently he was eating like GMO locusts or something. Anyway, he's huge. And then you move on to St. Peter. He's looking fabulous at 70. We can all agree. But he forgot his clothes. He's a little overexcited. So, I mean, the change in Peter is not indifferent. And so the idea behind this, there is a reasoning behind what he's doing. This is not Michelangelo, I just like to paint naked men. There's a reason behind this. It is really a question, one of the fundamental questions they have that's coming up in the midst of the Reformation. What does what you do matter in salvation? How much does what you do matter? And so these saints, who are seen as heaven's athletes because they have done extraordinary things, are represented in heaven as figures that are athletic. The typical way of showing martyrs, do you guys know how you recognize a martyr in art? I have really high hopes for you, Ireland. Don't let me down. I'm accustomed to my students not knowing, but I have really high hopes. Didn't you people save civilization? Yes, thank you. Faith restored. Okay, yes, it's a palm frond. How do you spot a martyr? A martyr holds a palm frond, okay? Those are the martyrs in the Last Judgment we have in the Vatican museums, painted 1150. All these people, that's Stephen on the right, all the people are nameless, they're all martyrs. They all wear long pastel dresses, and they wear big gold halos, and they hold palm fronds. Why are they holding palm fronds? Because they're athletes. And in ancient art, always, when you want to see the victorious wrestler, the wrestler's holding his crown of victory and he's holding his palm frond. It's a symbol of athletic victory. From time immemorial, we talk about the martyrs as heaven's athletes. They cross the finish line of heaven first, but instead of showing them nude, because you can imagine we have a few issues with that, instead we show them with these long pastel dresses, and they hold the symbol of victory until Michelangelo comes along and decides, yeah, no. And he decides to show you this external, he shows the internal fortitude that the martyrs have, the only way he knows, which is to show it as exterior strength. For a room full of men who collected those ancient sculptures, it's going to make perfect sense. They will understand perfectly. But then things go wrong. This is the famous portrait that in the figure of St. Bartholomew, who, by the way, was skinned alive, but his skin grew back, and so it all worked out okay. And then you see him holding his old skin, which was identified in 1925 as a caricature of Michelangelo. I put down this quote from a poem he wrote exactly at this time. I think it's a very beautiful thing to realize that Michelangelo really was a faith-filled, faithful man, and that particularly in painting The Last Judgment, he was deeply concerned. He was very, very much taken with thoughts of the end of his life. And so he uses this idea of like shedding this old skin to become something new. And it's kind of a lovely image that reinforces this idea of Michelangelo showing himself as this old husk. And then, of course, we have the women of heaven, whom I think are fabulous. But in the lineup of things that people say in the Vatican museums, we have Michelangelo showing these incredibly powerful women. That's Catherine of Alexandria there, who looked like she could bench press several wheels. The two women over here on the left-hand side I tend to think are probably Perpetua and Felicity, but you see a whole bunch of holy women who are super tough. And it's a reminder, as we see here in the hagiography of female saints, that no less are the women, no less are women martyrs or women saints. They are no less powerful, they are no less determined, they are no less courageous than men. There is nothing lesser in the sacrifice of St. Agnes or St. Agatha or St. Cecilia than there is of a Sebastian or Lawrence. We have never had second-tier ideas in the martyrs. They are equally brave and courageous. And so we have these images. Michelangelo, again, applies the only way he understands to represent that kind of fortitude by giving us these extraordinarily powerful figures, which, of course, every day I'm listening to people say, oh, I didn't like women because, they're just, boys with breasts, and I don't understand why you make them look so masculine. I don't understand. I mean, that's very demeaning, and I can't even imagine why they would possibly think that that was a good idea. I don't know. I'll just leave it at that. The things about this modern age that I don't understand. And then also there's another aspect of the painting that will throw people in the old age, in that age. You'll notice that people are very affectionate. In the age of coronavirus, the image on the right is deeply disturbing. Where is your 1 meter distance, people? But you know what? Michelangelo is not doing anything new. Look what Fra Angelico has on the other side. It's the same thing. This idea that we get to be reunited, we get to hug each other and kiss each other and feel that joy of being together in heaven is something that the patron saint of painting shows us, and Michelangelo does. The difference is, of course, the lack of clothes. And so, the real problem with this painting, this will be the thing that people focus in on. The real problem with the painting is the imagery of Jesus himself. Jesus has never really been seen this way. Jesus is often seen seated on a throne, usually dressed, but this is an unusual way of showing him. Michelangelo shows a Jesus who I affectionately call Terminator Jesus. He is the toughest, roughest Jesus in the history of art. He looks away. He doesn't seem particularly interested in you, and he seems terribly powerful and somewhat daunting. So for a member of the clergy who is endowed 1 million monasteries to pray for his soul, thinking he got everything under control, running into that guy might make you think twice, and that's the point of this Jesus. Jesus is supposed to impress a bunch of people who have been paying for Jesus paintings for the past 30 years of their lives. The mellow guy with the long hair and sandals is not going to do a thing for them. They need a Jesus. They need to produce a Jesus that will make them think twice. Michelangelo drew together 2 ancient sculptures that were in the Vatican collection. The power of this work, known as the Belvedere Torso, a 60 BC sculpture, signed actually on the base, and the head of the most beautiful work we have, the Apollo Belvedere, given by Julius II, is the first work of the Vatican Museum. He's a classical sculpture with all that perfect physical beauty, but the aloofness of the face. So he put together this incredibly powerful body and this incredibly aloof face, this Hellenistic and classical, to make a Jesus who seems absolutely unapproachable, except for one thing. The figure of Mary had never been placed where he placed her. So Jesus usually stands alone, as I showed you in the earlier paintings. As a matter of fact, never before had someone had Mary sharing Jesus's throne. And as a matter of fact, if you look closely, here's another example. She's down here in the corner. See, she's wearing white on the left-hand side. Here, she's right next to him. She's right by the wound in Jesus's side, from whence the church sprang. And so we see a Mary very, very differently orchestrated. And the best part of this is one of the most wonderful moments in the history of art when I can prove to you what I'm saying, because in art history that's not always a given. And so you have the first drawing he does on the left. He is Jesus seated isolated, as you would typically do. Mary sits on the lower left-hand side, her hands raised, actively pleading for people. Version number 2, Jesus is still in the same position. Mary has gotten up from her chair. She approaches him with her arms open the way she does in the Madonna of the Misericordia when she has her cape, and she's bringing a whole slew of people who are coming up right behind her. And in version number 3, he places her right by his side. Let's not kid around. You want to talk to Jesus, talk to her. She'll get you in. And by the way, at this point, you notice that virtually everyone in the painting is saved. And in my favorite fun fact regarding the Last Judgment, there are apparently no women in hell, which my husband claims is an oversight. But I'll take it. The image of Mary is a beautiful conglomeration. You'll show you the other half, but look how lovely. Why is she so powerful? She's so powerful because of that moment. That image is very recognizable as the moment she says to the angel Gabriel, "I am the handmaiden of the Lord. Let it be done to me according to thy will." That yes, that active yes, that continuous yes means that even at that moment, he will say yes to her. And then the other half of this figure, oh, I see, she's not there. So at the other side, I'm going to back up for a second. So from here, we see the figures casting down. From here, we see the figures on the other side casting down into hell. There aren't very many at all. It's a very limited number of figures that are cast into hell. And the interesting thing is there's no real definition of what gets you sent to hell. The only crime that's actually illustrated clearly is the money bags with the keys. So that's the crime of simony. That's the only one that he specifically identifies. And then we end up with this lower figure on the bottom. This painting, all of this, a lot of my discussion with you is to help you understand why this painting got into so much trouble. It got into so much trouble that it was nearly scraped off the wall. It had to do with people being somewhat shocked at a disorienting painting that used images that were not familiar to people. The real troublemaker was the printing press, which means an internal argument between a couple of cardinals. You know, there may be too many figures that are nude. I don't know, what do you think? That went public. It went viral. And so, if you will, people all over Europe were seeing cheap copies of this image, each one more scandalized than the other. Oh my gosh. They're unrolling a piece of paper expecting a lot of figures with fluttering drapery and wringing hands. They see 391 naked gyrating men, and they're thinking, oh my goodness, Martin Luther's right. They're a bunch of perverts in Rome. So overnight, this painting becomes the biggest liability of the Catholic Church. Someone who didn't like Michelangelo, of course, took advantage to call him a pornographer. Michelangelo famously got even by painting him into the painting with the ears of a donkey and a snake wrapped around himself. But ultimately, the painting had to be censored, as it were, when in 1564, the year Michelangelo died, an extraordinary meeting of the Council of Trent ordered that 30 of the most offensive figures be covered. And somehow that has become what we focus on when we look at the Last Judgment. But what he really gave us Michelangelo in this work, in this space, is this remarkable universality. So to not end on a note of the naked figures and the censorship, I'd like to end on the note of what that space means. And again, it's a joy and a particular privilege of mine to be able to sit in the back of that chapel and watch people come in from all over the world every day. And they stand in a space where they're all brought together, they're shoulder to shoulder, but everybody's looking up. Everybody's looking in the same direction. They're looking up, they're looking forward. forward. And the way that he unfolded this story, the nudity of those figures is a key part of it. They're not stuck in a time or a space or a location. They're just these beautiful bodies. They represent the best that we could be. Those bodies are so perfect and so beautiful. They are the best that we can be. And so he brought us together to take us through the story of the beginning and ending. And so I think the person I would like to begin with him, and I'd like to end with him, the person who I've always found the most inspiring in understanding the Sistine Chapel was St. John Paul II. St. John Paul II is the one who opened my eyes to understanding this complementarity to men and women when he called it the sanctuary of the theology of the body. And for years I've been working on this off this idea. But also John Paul II, an artist himself, wrote his beautiful Roman triptych. These poems, one of the 3 poems takes place in the Sistine Chapel. And in many ways I think he explains it when he says the beginning is invisible, everything here points to it. All this abundant visibility released by human genius. Here the end too is invisible, though, traveler, your eye is caught by the vision of the Last Judgment. How to make the invisible visible, how to penetrate beyond the bounds of good and evil. The visible and invisible pierce us from these walls. Michelangelo Buonarroti, in these 2 cycles, 2 systems, succeeded taking one extraordinary man in extraordinary time, taking the beginning of the Bible and the end of the Bible, making it visible, making it meaningful, making it something that would continue to speak to people for 500 years running and hopefully for 500 years more. Thank you.
We do have, as you've seen, a reception set up in the rear, but Liz has agreed to take a few questions. So if you have a brief question, but I would like to take the privilege of the first question, which is, could you just expand a little on the Laocoon story? My recollection from the first time you explained it to me is he came looking for it, thinking they had it in Rome, and he was mistaken. Is that not right?
What makes the Laocoon famous? So the sculpture I was showing you before, does that ring a bell? The Laocoon sculpture, the sculpture of the guy it's very, very, very famous. It's famous for 2 reasons. Reason number 1 is that the Laocoon is a story from Virgil's Aeneid, which is one of the best known stories. Laocoon, I'm very excited to be here in a country where I'm automatically presuming you are more literate than my sophomore students. And Laocoon's from Virgil's Aeneid. He's the guy who coined the most famous phrase in ancient literature: "You must fear the Greeks, especially when they bear gifts." So he's very famous for that. To begin with, he's crushed to death by two giant sea serpents sent by the gods. So everybody knows that image because already in the ancient world, it's the death of Laocoon means that Troy falls. That means Aeneas leaves. Aeneas ends up in Lazio, and his great-great-grandsons are Romulus and Remus. There is no Roman kid who doesn't know Laocoon. The other reason why the sculpture is famous, it was written up 2,000 years ago by a man named Pliny the Elder. He was a Roman statesman and an aristocrat. He went everywhere, he saw everything, he wrote everything down, and so we have this amazing book. Art historians look at Pliny's natural histories as a Michelin guide to the ancient world. Best stuff, where it is, what's great about it. And in that book, he describes Laocoon. He says it's in Rome. He says it's by 3 Greek artists from the island of Rhodes, and then he says, this is his commentary, it surpasses anything done in painting or sculpture up to this point. I mean, that's like, it's a 5-star TripAdvisor review. And so Michelangelo, Pliny's book, when Pliny died trying to watch the explosion of Vesuvius from too close, he didn't have the book with him, so the book survived. It was translated into Italian when Michelangelo was 3. That means he grew up studying sculpture, reading Pliny, because a copy was in the Medici house. He gets to Rome, right? And, there he is working on this giant sculptural project for Julius II, and he's in Julius's sculpture garden, and he's saying things like, yeah, guys, has anybody ever seen the Laocoon? Because I've heard about this Laocoon. I'd really love to see this Laocoon. And the answer is always, no, Mike, sorry, Laocoon's been lost for about 1,000 years, so, maybe like look at our Apollo or something. January 14th of 1506, he was called away from breakfast. He was having breakfast at his friend Giuliano Sangallo's house. The two of them were brought over to the other side of the hill, to the other side of the city, to the Appian Hill, right next to the Colosseum, where some guy named De Freddi was digging out a vineyard. They walked through the newly tilled earth. They came to a hole in the ground. They looked in the hole, and there was the Laocoon covered with roots, dirt, and leaves. Michelangelo, Giuliano go, oh, there's the long-lost Laocoon. I mean, if there was ever a situation where it really sounded like God was saying, hey, Mike, I think you should be sculpting, it was pretty much when he found the Laocoon. And then the Pope buys it for him. I mean, not for him, but the Pope buys it. The line of buyers was about a mile long. The Pope buys it. It shows up in the Vatican. Michelangelo, obviously, oh, my destiny is sculpture. And then the Pope says, yeah, I need 12 apostles on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. So, I mean, he's one of the things I find so admirable about Michelangelo and Raphael, and to a lesser extent Leonardo. What I find so remarkable about them, I always use them as kind of as a personal guide. You get a project that you don't want to do, just take it and make it your own. It's my sort of young people advice. You see, I wasn't planning on making my mark this way. Yep. Take it and then make your mark that way. It's one of the really great stories about people playing to their strengths, and I love that very much about both Michelangelo and Raphael. Allora. Sibyls. I love Sibyls. Okay, so the Sibyls. The Sibyls are, let's see if we can get back to them very quickly. Sibyls are figures that I love very much. Sibyls are pagan prophetesses. And what they are, the Sibyls make these prophecies for the pagan world. And actually, interestingly about the Sibyls is that they come from, there we go, these are my two favorites. Sibyls come from all different parts of the ancient world. You have a Persian Sibyl, Libyan Sibyl, Delphic Sibyl. So you actually have representatives of all the known continents at the time. Sibyls are these pagan prophetesses. They make prophecies that, for a very long, complicated reason that I would really love to tell you, but I think Father would hit me over the head if I got into this. For a very long, complicated reason, they sound really apocalyptic, messianic, and they fit right in with Christianity. So these pagan prophetesses are making these prophecies, which when they start reading them in 1200, 1300, 1400, they sound a lot. They're talking about things like a virgin's going to bear a child, it's going to bring peace to the world, there's going to be this, and they're like, oh my gosh, these Sibyls knew. So the Renaissance starts to use Sibyls as complements to the prophets to suggest that while the prophets clearly prepare the world for the coming of Christ, because God is talking to them, the Sibyls are getting a more like muddled, messed up frequency alert, so that the pagan world is somehow being prepared for the coming of Christ as well. So it's kind of a way of understanding that when that appointed time in the reign of Augustus is not a happenstance. It's that the world was prepared for that moment. And for the Renaissance, of course, it's a justification for them to be able to draw from the pagan world as they like. But more for artists, what it offers them is the possibility to paint female figures next to male figures. Otherwise, it's going to be apostles, church fathers, patriarchs, blah, 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 blah. And then that way they can put female figures and male figures in, and it just becomes more aesthetically pleasing and more representative of the world that surrounds them. Thank you. I love Sibyls. Yes, sorry.
And I really like the parallels you were drawing between Adam and Noah. Are there parallels between the sealing and the Last Judgment in a similar way? Are there sort of things that speak to one another or not so much?
So it's a really interesting question. There are parallels between the sealing and the Last Judgment. Those parallels fall particularly in the new Adam and the new Eve. There's a sort of a visual parallel when you see the image of the visual parallel in Noah's Ark, just because it's very chaotic. The scene of Noah's Ark you can see he drew on those same skills to create figures in motion in the lower left and the lower right hand side of the painting, and then the imagery of particularly the creation of woman. So the dead center of the ceiling. In the dead center of the ceiling, you have Eve stepping out of Adam's side. Look at how this works. There you are. So she moves out of literally Adam's side, and look at her with her hands. And that is actually the first drawing that he did of Mary coming to Jesus when he was thinking about the Last Judgment. So this is he matures that concept of the new Adam, the new Eve. By the time he paints the Last Judgment, again, it's 25 years, he's really matured it into the point where he's confident enough to make that imagery of Mary and Jesus, which is not, that's just not the norm. And as a matter of fact, to go a step further, I think a lot of what makes the painting upsetting to people are things like that. This representation of Mary and Jesus, this Mary kind of mediatrix idea that he's showing, it's kind of like, wait. And so it's easier for people to say, yeah, everyone's naked, than to really articulate this aloofness of Jesus and this strange interaction with Mary, which is a little hard to follow. It's just easier to say, I'm offended by the nudity, than to try to articulate that. I think that was a great question. Sometimes on tours, because it takes me so long to answer a question. There was one day, and someone said to her husband, please don't ask her any more questions. Have you guys hit that point yet? Yes.
I'm kind of curious, does it require faith to really properly appreciate this artwork? And secondarily, does it require faith to really create this artwork?
Two very separate things. So the question being requiring, for those who didn't hear it, requiring faith to appreciate the artwork, and requiring faith to produce the artwork. Requiring faith to appreciate the artwork, I don't think is absolutely necessary, as in fact that tests that there are people who come out of the Sistine Chapel with no faith whatsoever and are still dazzled by it. Just like St. Peter's is a church that knocks everyone's socks off regardless of faith or no faith. So I'm not entirely sure how much faith you have to appreciate it. But in your emphasis on really appreciate it, I think the best way for me to speak to that is to just give you a little anecdote of my own life. I went to University of Chicago, aka the great atheist maker, and then I went to University of Bologna, which of course is well, not of course, but it was in a communist city, and not particularly religion friendly. So my entire experience of art history, my entire study of art history, was completely faith absent. So this is not about Adam and Eve. It's totally secondary. What's important about the work is that the reclining figures come from the Endymion figures, which we see in the Roman sarcophagi that Michelangelo had access to. That's how we look at these works of art. We just had a very technical and very formal way of looking at it, and that was basically how I studied art. The University of Bologna had a thesis. Their primary leading light had a methodology involving context, and so his theory was, you must understand the soil in which art is produced to understand how special and unique it is. This is how the sommelier thing eventually happens, but neither here nor there. In Bologna, the reason why they liked it is because they're always competing with the Florentines, and so the idea is you have to understand the Bolognese soil to understand that the Bolognese produced Renaissance art that's better than the Florentines. But when I came to Rome and applied that methodology to the Sistine Chapel, and then I began to realize, well, the soil that these people are, because there were always questions in the back of my head that didn't make sense, and I couldn't find answers to, and the books didn't give it to me. So I would say to myself, well, I guess I just have to use this methodology. I'll understand the soil that this comes from. So I took these night theology classes, started studying a little bit about Scripture and interpretation of Scripture, and the more I did it, the more I realized, wait a minute, If I look at this, if I look at the Sistine Chapel from the point of view that Michelangelo believes this stuff, then there is no question that I cannot give you, a plausible answer for. I dare you. I begin to realize that once you use that lens, it all makes sense. And once I started using that lens, it began to occur to me that not only does he believe this stuff, but why don't I? And so really, I mean, it's things like the Sistine Chapel, St. Peter's, the Pietà, my husband, a very good friend of mine. These are the things that brought me back to the faith. And that was not where I was going at all, but really, so in answer to your question, not only does the appreciation of this art grow with faith, but there comes a point where it seemed to me to be absurd to not believe this. How could there be, I felt a bit like Peter, well, where else am I going to go? And so it really is, so I do think at the end of the, and that kind of argument, that kind of witness that is that compelling can only come from someone who believes this too. So that this kind of art also has to be made by someone who has faith. The beauty of the Sistine Chapel to me, when I look at it, when I see it, it's kind of, this is going to be the world's weirdest comparison. It's like when Neo sees the Matrix. I can see all the lines working together. I can see the history of the faith and the beauty of the art and the circumstances of the history and the people. I can see it all working together. And there's no way, I can't fathom a Sistine Chapel that was made by atheists for atheists. It just can't be. Does that make sense? Yes?
This image here of Eve emerging from Adam's side, and previously you showed us, that I'd never noticed, that beautiful, tender image of God the Father with his arm, that intimate embrace while he's breathing life into Adam. That Eve seems like a different person to this Eve. Like, is that just not a thing that he would have, why is that?
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting, and highly problematic point. This Eve, who has her hair up, looks a little bit, so it seems to me that this Eve kind of becomes more concrete as she becomes more real. That's about the best I can do for you here. But I mean, she starts here as a figure who's really just a sort of a very feminine figure, by the way. I'm always hearing about Michelangelo doesn't know anything about women, but that face, that sort of high cheekbone, that sort of, she's quite a beautiful feminine face. Her body seems sort of slimmer up here than usual. Then the Eve that comes out of Adam's side gets a little bit more solid. We didn't see her but I think the reason why she's much more solid is because she has to occupy a lot of space. So he makes these slight alterations to Eve, and then the one that gets strange is her hair gets dark over here. Eve apparently dyed her hair in the Garden of Eden. And again, in this one, the aspect of the body that he really wants to emphasize is the immortality versus the mortality. So I think his interest with the body of Eve really is a very kind of technical problem of, in this case, the contrast between the two. In the other one, occupying a very large space. What is really, really interesting about this one is she's the link between God and man. She really is the link between God and man. Her feet are in his side, her hand is before God. She is the bridge. So she needs to be noticeable, right?
And finally, the knuckle, you mentioned Jesus Christ. Can you say a little bit about that?
That's a technical point. I promise I'll be fast. It's a technical point. The extra knuckle, the extra hand, when you do that, it means you want the figure to be emphasized. You want people to notice. So he's intentionally elongated the hand They elongated the finger so that you will understand that figure is part of the mix. Like, he's not like all the other angels around. That little figure over there, the one that looks at you, is different from the others, and it's part of a connector from one finger, which is elongated to give life to Adam, to the other figure that is already perched on the shoulder of the new Adam. Okay, I'm going.
We're going to leave it there because I still have to feed Liz and her husband Tom. But we want to have a few minutes for her to mingle with folks in the back during our reception. So what always happens is our speakers get trapped here. So we're going to give you a minute to be the first to go back and have a bit of wine or some tea if you'd like. And just want to thank you, Liz. This was extraordinary. You always outperform even the highest of expectations that we have. And I'm sure everyone here feels as I do again. So let us thank you.